between the two, which is of interest because often we think that all slave owners were the same. No, they were not. Some were very poor. Some had to work with their slaves day in and day out there on the farm just to survive. And some people also had only domestic slaves. And there were a number, about 3,000 slave owners that were black themselves. Very interesting. These are the things that we cover in the other class on secession. But those are the details that I wanted you to make yourself note how he disliked the planters class and the aristocracy of the South. The other point that I want you to remember is that he was elected to the House of Representatives as a Jacksonian Democrat. That is a follower of Andrew Jackson, a follower of the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. That was the party that was against the tariff. They did not want the tariff. They wanted small government. They wanted no investment in infrastructure, no internal improvements. They had all they wanted. They had slaves, they had a slave economy, they had land. The only thing they wanted was more land out in the West. So this was, and they were also against the Bank of the United States. That was the Jacksonian.
Sorry, that was me, accidentally.
The Jacksonian Democratic Party. Andrew Johnson in the House of Representatives was in favor of the annexation of Texas. Why? Because that would give the southern states more land on which to extend slavery, and was also in favor of the Mexican War because, again, it would allow the United States to move west. Remember the story about Manifest Destiny? How the United States was destined to extend all the way to the Pacific. He was certainly against the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso, as you remember, stipulated that in any lands that was acquired from Mexico during the Mexican War, there would be no slavery. But that never became law. But what the Wilmot Proviso did was brought slavery to the forefront of the national debate. Up until then, they had kept slavery off to the side. Let's not talk about it. Remember the gag rules? Let's not talk about it. Not an issue. The Wilmot Proviso, however, brought it to the forefront, made everybody aware of it as a national issue. In Congress also, this man introduced the Homestead Bill, in which people would acquire title to 160 acres in the western states or territories if they worked the land for 5 years. You say, big deal. No. These were people coming from Europe that had nothing, absolutely nothing. And all of a sudden, they are faced with the possibility of acquiring 160 acres of good farmland just by farming it. So this was a major windfall for the settlers coming from Europe. This bill, however, was not approved the first time. He reintroduced the bill in 1857, but it was vetoed by President Buchanan. What was the reason for the veto? The federal government has no business giving away land. That was the argument. Nowadays, the federal government gives away everything. Cell phones, they give away just about everything. But at that time, land was a no-no. So Andrew Jackson, therefore, was also elected governor of Tennessee twice. So he had quite a career as a younger man before the Civil War. Now, during the secession crisis, Johnson, remember, he came from a slave state. He was a slave owner. He was committed, however, to the preservation of the Union. And this is not an unusual stance at that time. There were many people, remember Breckinridge that we talked about before, that were in favor of slavery and the Union. The people in Maryland, the leadership in Maryland. Maryland was a slave state. There were slaves in Maryland. But Maryland would not secede. They were in favor of the Union with slavery. Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, West Virginia. All those states had slaves, but stayed in the Union. So this business of being committed to the Union and to slavery is not contradictory. In our minds, it is somewhat difficult to assimilate. But at that time, it was an acceptable position. Many newspapers felt this way. If slavery is what we need to pay for the time being to preserve the Union, let's have slavery. In 1860, Andrew Johnson in Tennessee voted for Breckinridge, and he remained a Unionist and a senator, even after Tennessee left on June 8th, 1861. So Tennessee left the Union, seceded in the summer of 1861. Fort Sumter was in April. So it took Tennessee about 3 months to make up its mind to secede. Again, there was a lot of conflict between the people who wanted to stay in the Union and those who wanted to withdraw from the Union. Andrew Johnson himself believed that secession was illegal and that the Union was intact. And this was the same opinion that Lincoln had, that the Union was still intact. Well, put yourself in his position. He comes from a slave state that has just seceded from the Union, but he's a senator in Washington, and he is against secession, but he is for slavery. Well, the newspapers had a carnival. They tore him to pieces left and right. And there were many death threats. He was burned in effigy, jeered by crowds. At least 3 attempts were made on his life that were legitimate attempts. And he was never hurt. Back in Tennessee, his property, his home, his farm, they were expropriated. They were taken away by the government because he was pro-union. His family was ejected from their home back in Tennessee. Even though he had been elected a number of times to different offices, his family was booted out of their home. And once in a train, he was threatened by a mob, and he had to pull out a gun in order to forestall an assault by a mob. So the man had a lot of courage, and he knew how to face a mob. He became a champion for the Union. At this time, he was a senator from the state that had seceded. He was the only senator that remained in the Senate when a state seceded. All the other senators from the seceded states went back or resigned. So he became a champion for the Union. And this is the other item that is of importance to remember. He knew that the southern states had to be defeated in order to maintain the Union. And in order to defeat the southern states, they had to do away with slavery. So during the war, Andrew Johnson was in favor of the abolition of slavery in order to weaken the Confederate States and end the war. That was during the war. And he made it very, very clear that even though I am a slave owner and I have property in slaves, I am in favor of doing away with slavery in order to weaken the southern states and bring the war to an end. That's a key concept to understand. It was not for humanitarian purposes. It was not because of morality. It was not because of justice. It was because there was a war on. And he felt that doing away with slavery would facilitate the completion of the war. He also advocated civil rights for freedmen and harsh punishment for traitors. He was considered to be a war Democrat, the only senator that remained in the Senate from a seceded state. And these concepts are clear, are they? And that way we can understand what happened afterwards. He remained a Democrat. He was a Jacksonian Democrat. We made that very clear before. He was not a Republican. He was a Jacksonian Democrat. Lincoln appointed him in 1862 military governor of Tennessee and a general in the army. That was his state, Tennessee. And he did very, very well. He favored freeing slaves, again, to decrease the influence of the southern states, extend civil rights to freedmen, and justice for the leaders of the Confederacy. A sticky point was this: land would be confiscated and redistributed. That's what the Freedmen's Bureau wanted to do, and at times did it. So all the people like Scarlett O'Hara's neighbors who had 12 oaks, those big farms, big plantations would be cut in pieces and redistributed to former slaves and to Union soldiers. In other words, their property would be expropriated, would be confiscated and redistributed. How fair was that to the people who owned property?
Would they keep their house?
Were they?
Would they keep their house?
No. They were OUT, out.
Not as fair as what they did to Johnson before the war.
Yeah. That we did. So that was a matter of great debate. What to do in the South with property. There was a group that wanted the land to be confiscated and redistributed, and there was a group, Lincoln included, that wanted to bring the states back in and do not redistribute the land. The Confederate debt would be repudiated. You remember from Gone with the Wind again, how Scarlett O'Hara's father had invested heavily in Confederate bonds. But they were worthless. They were not worth it. The paper they were printed on. There were promises of a government that no longer existed. So all that money that people invested in the Confederate States bonds was lost. So the Confederate debt was repudiated. The slave code under Andrew Johnson was eliminated in Tennessee in 1862, 63, 64. And Tennessee returned to the Union in the winter of 1865, way ahead of the other southern states. I think Louisiana was close by. But Andrew Johnson did very well in his state, bringing the state back into the Union.
How would that have worked if the original landowners kept their land, but no slaves? They couldn't afford to pay an hourly or daily wage to people to work it, and they couldn't work all those acres personally.
Right.
How would that have worked from an economic standpoint?
Probably not well. Probably not well.
Sharecropping.
Yeah, or leasing, yeah.
Certainly not well. But the problems that we'll get to that they faced were tremendous. The point that we're trying to make here is that as military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson did very well as an executive. He got things moving. He abolished slavery. He tried to give the freedmen a certain number of rights. But this confiscation was punitive. What they wanted to do was punish the ones that had left the Union. That was the whole idea of the redistribution of land. It was to be punitive. Around 1863, Lincoln began to make plans for Reconstruction. And that will be the problem that we will address in the next few minutes. Lincoln's plan that he never really fully developed, but generally speaking, he wanted to readmit states to the Union when they repudiated rebellion and rescinded the secession ordinances. And this is a point of debate. They wanted 10% of voters to pledge allegiance to the Union. Only 10%. That was Lincoln's original idea. If 10% of the people in one state say, okay, we want to go back to the Union and we will be good Union members, we will not secede or try to secede again. We'll play ball, we'll go along to get along. Only 10%. Others wanted a lot more. Lincoln wanted full pardon and amnesty for all but the political leaders and the top brass in the services. Lincoln was particularly in favor of returning property to the owners and ratify the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that forbids slavery in the United States. So those were the general specifications of Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. What happened was that Reconstruction took two roads. One we can call Congressional Reconstruction, and the other one we can call Executive or Administrative Reconstruction. Let's talk about Congressional Reconstruction. Congressional Reconstruction began with the Wade-Davis bill in 1865. And right away, there was a controversy regarding the number of people that had to pledge allegiance to the Union before they were readmitted. The Wade-Davis bill specified 50% of voters. Originally, Lincoln said only 10%. But the Wade-Davis bill wanted 50%. freedmen's rights would be guaranteed in federal courts. That is, they would be able to go to court and act as jurors. They were able to give testimony. They were able to speak before a judge. They were subjected to the writ of habeas corpus. In other words, all of those civil rights that people fought so much for. The Freedmen's Bureau was again made by the Congress, and that was the bureau that was supposed to help freedmen get back into the normal life of the South. The big problem with the Freedmen's Bureau was that it was not funded appropriately, and it had that issue about the land, about taking land from people and splitting it up and parceling it out. That was felt to be very, very, very unpopular. But remember that that was a punitive action that was designed to punish the states that had receded. So confiscation and redistribution of real property was part of the program of the Congressional Reconstruction.
What about the vote?
What about the?
Did freedmen get the vote?
Not yet,
Okay.
not yet. Remember, it took an amendment to the Constitution, the 15th Amendment, to get the freedmen to vote.
Well, that's important to the 50%, because if they had the vote, it would be easier to get the 50%.
Right. So, in the midst of all this, one needs to remember that early in 1864, people were tired of the war, just like we were tired of the Vietnam War at the end of the war. People were tired, nothing was happening. The armies were kind of slogging it out and not getting anywhere. In other words, there was this stasis or sluggishness and generalized unhappiness with the government. And Lincoln believed that he would not be elected for a second term. He really, really believed that he did not stand a prayer. Because things were just not going his way. They were just not going his way. For 4 years, there had been this war, and hundreds of thousands of people had been killed, and nothing had happened. So in order to improve his chances of re-election, the Republican Party was renamed. It became the National Union Party. And in order to attract other people to the National Union Party, he got rid of Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, who was a very fine, prudent, and fair man from Maine. And he expressed his desire to have Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat. Johnson never joined the party, even when he was nominated for vice president. All right, that's a key thing to remember. Johnson always remained a Democrat. All right, is that clear? So he was never part of the Republican Party. In 1864, Atlanta fell. There were other campaigns in the Shenandoah Valley and in the, at that time, what was the Midwest, now the border states. Things improved. And all of a sudden, Lincoln and Johnson were elected by a landslide. So it was really not necessary for Lincoln to withdraw his support of Hannibal Hamlin or to rename the party. He would have won anyway. But he did change his vice president, and this is what happened when Johnson became vice president. So this is the election of 1864. You can see that Tennessee went for the National Union Party, New England, the Great Lakes states, Louisiana, the Western states, and as far as McClellan, the Democratic Party, only Kentucky and Delaware and New Jersey. So it was really a very, very lopsided election, and that's how Johnson and Lincoln were elected. Then comes the inauguration. At that time, the inauguration was on March 4th. Why? Because somebody decided it was a good day. Why is the inauguration now on January 20th? Because they consulted the weather reports and they thought that by and large, generally speaking, January 20th is a good day. Cold, but not necessarily snowy or stormy. So
Right.
on Inauguration Day on March 4th, Johnson had come over from Tennessee. He was probably sick with either typhoid or malaria, which were very, very debilitating illnesses. At that time, the treatment for these things was very, very primitive. So he attended a party before the inauguration, and he toasted or was toasted too many times. So he was himself toast. So he was wasted by the time it became necessary for him to take the oath of office. He felt that he needed another drink or two before taking the oath of office, and somebody produced a bottle of brandy, and in other words, he was really sauced by the time he took the oath of office. So he takes the oath of office and he's supposed to say a few words, and he embarks on this tirade against the slave owners and the wealthy people in the South. Totally, totally inappropriate. Remember how in years past he had expressed this animosity towards wealthy people in the South? Well, he let it all out. He let it all out, and he made a fool of himself. He had to administer the oath of office to a group of senators. He couldn't do it because he was just so wasted. And it was really a major scandal in Washington, D.C. The newspapers had a heyday with him. There were no photographs at that time, but there were plenty of reporters who took down his diatribe and made it public. So he began on the wrong foot. He was a Democrat elected under a Republican administration. He was a slave owner, but he had done away with slavery in Tennessee. And he did not begin very well as vice president. 6 weeks later, Lincoln was assassinated. And Johnson was sworn in as president on tax day, 1865. He asked the members of the cabinet to remain at their posts. He did not fire them. And they helped him keep the government going. One thing that we need to remember is that at that time, when there was a new administration, the Congress adjourned the day the president and vice president took the oath of office. That was on March 4th. So the Congress that had met in early December on March 4th adjourned. That was the tradition, and that was the tradition for a long time. That Congress would not reassemble again until December 4th. So there were all these 8 months when Congress was away. And that was what happened in Washington at that time. There was no Congress in those months unless the president called his special session. So there was no Congress. And Andrew Johnson was faced with this situation. Now, let's put ourselves in his position. 1 million total casualties. Devastation in the former Confederate states. Farms and plantations neglected. Wealth evaporated, gone. 4 million slaves now freed that needed food, shelter, work, and protection. Just imagine, this is the kind of responsibility that Andrew Johnson faced when he took the oath of office on April 15th, following Lincoln's assassination. And he was not prepared. He did not have a staff. He did not have a secretary. He did not have any support. And that all he had to build up from scratch. He had experience. He had been military governor of Tennessee. He had extensive experience in Congress. Yeah, he had a lot of experience and a lot of willpower. And he was a strong man. But as far as the assistance he needed, he did not have. Who would have liked to be in that position? Overnight, going from being a drunken vice president to being the president and having these enormous responsibilities. Well, these were the realities that he had to face. Number one, many of the former slaves, most if not many, they were illiterate. They were not educated. They could not read or write. Many states in the South made it illegal to teach a slave to read or write, and punishable if you taught a slave to read or write.
Even after Reconstruction?
Say that again?
Even after this, with those laws in place?
They had before. Eventually they did the same thing. Now, many of the slave codes made it illegal to offer education. And eventually that developed into separate but equal and so forth. That's another seminar, the history of education. So the former Confederate states were simply hostile to the former slaves. And many of the northern states did not want slaves either. They did not want black people, including some of the states that we consider now most liberal, like some of the Great Lake states, like Minnesota. It was a very dismal situation. To finish up the problem, we said that Johnson was a war Democrat, belonged to the Democratic Party. But the Congress, particularly the Senate, was in the hands of the radical Republicans. And the radical Republicans were the ones who wanted to punish the South. They were the ones who wanted to inflict all the harm they could. They were the ones who wanted to split the territories and the big land holdings. So the situation politically was very, very unstable. Now, Johnson, when he becomes president, he faces all these problems. And he turns around and says, well, let's see what Congress has to say. Well, Congress is not in session. All the congressmen are home for the rest of the spring and the summer and part of the fall. What does he have? What can he do? He has to begin to do something. And this was executive or administrative reconstruction. At this time, remember the war had ended, and he was in favor of abolishing slavery in order to weaken the southern states and finish the war. At this time, his opinion on slaves and former slaves changed. He said, the war is over. The priority now is to get these states back into the Union. The second priority is civil rights for the freed slaves. But the number one priority for Johnson, exactly the same thing he had done in Tennessee, was to bring back the southern states into the Union. So his views on civil rights changed. Even though he had been recognized as a champion, he had given a speech once in Tennessee. And apparently he was a very good speaker. In that speech, he had said something like, you, former slaves, are going to be led into the promised land. Sounds like something Martin Luther King would have said. And somebody in the audience reached out and said, you be our Moses. And he said, fine, I'll be your Moses. Just follow me. So he was personally very popular amongst the former slaves, even though he was not a champion of civil rights. He had been a champion of abolition, but not necessarily of civil rights. He felt that the first priority was to bring the seceded states back into the Union. And this has been one of the reasons why he has been chastised. History has been very hard on him because of this position. So it was more important to bring the seceded states. The other thing that he believed that the federal government did not have the power under the Constitution to grant civil rights, other than the ones that were in the Constitution. Well, what happened with Amendments 13, 14, and 15? They granted civil rights. So it required constitutional amendments for the right to vote, the right of freedom, citizenship, and reversal of the hideous laws from the 1850s. So it required a number of constitutional amendments to grant a minimum of rights, because if it was not in the Constitution, if the powers had not been given to the federal government, those powers remain with the state. The same thing that was invoked when Roe versus Wade was revoked, that the federal government has no business legislating about abortion. It's a state issue. It's not in the Constitution, therefore it's a state issue. That was the argument during that decision. So the 15th Amendment was necessary to protect the right to vote. Andrew Johnson also published 2 proclamations. Nowadays they're called what? Executive orders? Is that what they're called nowadays? Great. 2 proclamations in May of 1865. Full pardon and amnesty for many Confederates. Provisional governor for North Carolina. Voters would be those who had voted in 1861, basically white landowners. But no mention of suffrage for freedmen or redistribution of real property. Once again, the emphasis of Andrew Johnson's policies, that is administrative or executive Reconstruction, was to get the states back into the Union. Let's take care of that political thing first. Let's get the states back into the Union, and then other issues will be addressed. The black coats we need to address because that's when they arose. We talked about the 15th Amendment that gave blacks or former slaves the right to vote. In order to offset the 15th Amendment, many states adopted black codes. Black codes maintained white supremacy and basically prevented the advance of former slaves. Any former slave looking for work, other than a farmer or a servant, had to have a court permit and pay a tax. Tax may have been $1 or $2, but still it was a tax. Vagrancy was common. Many of these people were homeless. They had nowhere to live, nowhere to work. And vagrancy was one of the so-called crimes that was punishable under the black codes. Freedmen, former slaves, had to show proof of home ownership or employment. Otherwise, they were considered vagrants. Convicts would be leased out for work to private entities. Do you remember Scarlett O'Hara, how she made money after the war? No? Did you ever from the movie or from the book? Milling, lumber.
She married a guy
She
who had lumber.
She had a lumber mill. And she staffed her lumber mill with convicts that were being leased out for work. And that included whites and blacks and everybody else, not just former slaves.
So what happened to somebody who was considered a vagrant?
Off to jail. Yeah, off to jail. Or they were moved up. And nobody wanted them. The northern states didn't want them. The southern states absolutely did not want them. No, not at all.
Oh,
And
almost like another form of slavery, isn't it?
in a way, sure.
Since,
No, they just went away around and around and around and around.
since apparently the jails leased them out to people to work.
Now, this is something that comes up in all the books, that the black codes stipulated that all contracts had to be validated by a white person. That a contract was not valid unless it had been validated by a white person. The other side of the coin is that most former slaves were illiterate. So bringing in a white person guaranteed somewhat of an advocate for them. So this business of having a white person review all contracts has two sides. Number one, a form of intimidation. Number two, a form of assuring that all is handed up and up. Most former slaves had never engaged in any kind of contract. Ever. Never. So the Black Codes assured that former slaves could not vote. They couldn't join the militia. They couldn't testify in court. Different states had different rules. And some states, particularly, much to our surprise, the northern states banned blacks from the states altogether. Now, the radical Republicans who were in control of Congress at that time wanted to enfranchise freedmen, anticipating that they would become good Republicans and would vote them back in. At the same time, they wanted to punish the Confederate leaders who were Democrats. So this was all political, and prevent Confederate leaders from holding office ever again. That was the general strategy of Reconstruction. When Congress came back, Johnson had already brought in North Carolina, had already moved Reconstruction along quite a bit. But Congress began to challenge the president. You do not have power to do this. We have the power to do that. Let's go through congressional or legislative reconstruction rather than executive reconstruction. These were the radical Republicans. Johnson was a war Democrat. So to begin with, right off the bat, there was confrontation and conflict. Johnson vetoed 29 pieces of legislation in 4 years. And the Congress overrode 15 bills by 2/3 of vote. So there was really a lot of bad blood there between the president and the Congress. Some of the pieces of legislation that were overridden includes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Reconstruction Act of 1867, when the South was divided into 5 military districts. Again, very punitive, sending in the army to maintain peace and order. And the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act was really a trap that the Congress passed. It was an act that said that any official in the federal government that is nominated by the president and approved by the Senate cannot be discharged unless the Senate approves his or her discharge. In other words, we appoint, we also facilitate or approve the discharge of a person. It was made so that only one person could break that law. Who is that person?
President?
President. There was a law so that only one person, the president, could break that law. That's the way it was made. It was a trap. I said, come on, we dare you, come on. Fire somebody that we have approved, and we'll have you. And sure enough, that was one of the reasons why Andrew Johnson was impeached by the Congress in 1867. I think they drew up 13 different articles of impeachment, including the tenure of Office Act. To summarize the different aspects of Reconstruction, Congressional Reconstruction advocated pledge of loyalty from the seceded states, swift justice for senior Confederates, rights for former slaves, and confiscation and redistribution of Confederate property. This was Congressional Reconstruction. This is what the Congress wanted to do, and this was punitive. The idea was to punish, kick, to step on the southern states while they were down. On the other hand, Executive Reconstruction aimed at the prompt admission of Confederate states to the Union, pardons and amnesty, return of real property to previous owners, and no federal legal requirement for black suffrage. That is, there was no federal requirement for former slaves to own land or to pay a toll tax or to do anything in order to vote. Originally, only wealthy white men voted. Same thing with the former slaves. There were many laws that prevented former slaves from voting until the 15th Amendment was passed. Are these differences clear? Because this is really a key concept in trying to understand that period. What the Congress wanted to do and what the executive wanted to do. Now, was it racist? Yes. Johnson was a slave owner. He had grown up and lived in a slave state, and he did not think very much of blacks. He once said, while being president, Negroes have shown less capacity for government than any other race of people. No independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands. On the contrary, whenever they have been left to their own devices, they have shown a constant tendency to relapse into barbarism. What shaded his opinion of these things? Haiti. Not even nowadays, Haiti is a mess. How about countries in Africa? Kenya? Niger? Niger is still up in the air. They're killing people left and right. And that was his opinion. His opinion was that from what he had seen in other parts of the world, the ability of people to have a successful democratic government with justice was very limited.
Of course, they weren't educated.
Right.
And
And they were different from what he was familiar with too. I imagine slave owners who saw slaves out in the homes, that huts or whatever you want to call them, and the practices that they had of getting together, they probably were appalled and thought it was barbaric, different, weird.
And this opinion was not unique to him. This opinion was widespread. Lincoln himself told Frederick Douglass when he visited the White House, look, you are never going to be like us. Never. Regardless of what you do, regardless what you achieve, you are never going to be the equal of the white man. It's a fact. That's not something I made up. It's just a fact. That was Lincoln himself. So Andrew Johnson was impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868. If he had been convicted by the Senate, the President pro tem of the Senate, Benjamin Wade, would have become president. Now, many people really disliked Andrew Johnson. He was very confrontational. He was very much in your face. He just did not have that many people traits to be able to endear himself to others. Like many people didn't like him, but some people really loathed Benjamin Wade. And when it came to voting, sure, many of the radical Republicans voted to indict, but they were short of one vote because a number of people just could not stand the idea of having Benjamin Wade as president. So it was not that Andrew Johnson escaped impeachment and conviction on his own, but because the alternative was even more odious to the Senate. Yes.
Why was Benjamin Wade so disliked?
The history books say that he was hard on people, and that he was somewhat selfish. And he had been in the Senate for a long time. And when people are in the legislature for a long time, they tend to make enemies along the way. Enemies that really do not go away. This is why how many speakers of the House have become president? How many leaders in the Senate become president?
LBJ.
I answer that.
Yeah.
Very few, very, very few. And the idea, what happens is that throughout the process of becoming prominent in their respective chambers, they antagonize and irritate and piss off a lot of people.
So also, was it a two-third vote requirement for impeachment?
Yes, absolutely. It was 2/3 vote requirement. So they were short one vote. Yes, please.
Yeah, and well, there's another issue too, which was that the person who was credited for that vote was, he had been told that he would not get, he was denied patronage under Wade. If Wade became president, he wouldn't get any patronage. And the other thing was that the pro-Johnson forces had contributed $150,000 to his election fund. And so then they accused him of bribery. You know, and JFK, who wrote the book Profiles in Courage, this man was one of his profiles in courage for not voting for the impeachment. But it wasn't necessarily, may not have been such a profile in courage. It may have been a profile in politics.
Were there gold bars and involved in that case?
But it was $150,000, which was a lot of money back then.
Yes, a lot of money.
Yeah.
Are things any different?
That's the problem.
So the thing was, with politics. So impeachment failed On Christmas Day, 1868, he issued an amnesty for all but the most important Confederates. So it was just a blanket pardon. And he went back to Tennessee. He tried to get back into politics. He eventually was appointed to the Senate by the Tennessee legislature. So the Senate that had impeached him took him back in as a member. And he died several months later. In history, he has been criticized and chastised because he did not push for civil rights for the freed slaves. And the explanation for that may be that his main interest was in getting the Union back together and that civil rights would eventually come about. He also believes, like we said a moment ago, that the federal constitution did not give the executive the power to extend rights to former slaves. That's why the 15th Amendment was necessary to provide for the vote. It required an amendment for former slaves to be able to vote. So the situation was really not that clear or clear cut. He faced an enormous challenge, an enormous obstacles when he took office. And he probably did not help himself by being so antagonistic with Congress. If he had been more conciliatory, things would have been very different. Things would have been very different if Lincoln had not changed his vice president and Hannibal Hamlin had become President Hamlin. Hamlin was an honest, straightforward, humble man that gave everybody his due. He was very much against slavery. He was more against slavery than Lincoln was. So he would have pursued things differently. But Reconstruction may not have been the destructive episode in our history that it became. And government would have been able to recover a lot faster. I think this is the last slide, isn't it?
There's one more.
Oh, one more. Oh yeah, this is the analysis of the resources that we have. That he abandoned the pursuit of civil rights for freedmen, vetoed important legislation, and paralyzed government during his impeachment. Those are the criticisms. On the other hand, he never wavered as a unionist. He had great courage, great determination. He wanted to get the Union back together. That's what he wanted to do. And he truly believed that, as we just said, the executive did not have the power to advance civil rights by itself, and that it would require a constitutional amendment.
So with Lincoln's, when Congress took a recess after he did they bring Congress back?
Yes. When Lincoln was elected in the fall of 1860, he took office in March of 1861, and Congress had adjourned that morning. So he immediately called a special session of Congress to come back and deal with the secession. which they couldn't do. They tried their very best.
And with the current issue we have with the government shutting down and the Congress takes a recess, there's no way to bring them back?
No, they would come back if the president called the Congress back. And that's what Lincoln did. Lincoln called in the Congress and they assembled in the spring of 1861. But by then, all the southern states had seceded, and there was no point in holding them together.
So why wouldn't the president bring Congress back now?
They're there.
It's a question of money.
Well, and just calling them back will not make them functional.
What was that?
Just calling them back will not make them functional. They're dysfunctional now. Being adjourned does not make them
Less functional.
less functional.
The Congress apparently remains functioning.
It's
It's the money with which the government pays employees and everything else that is not budgeted. That's what is meant by closing down the government.
I think what he's saying is maybe have them come together and they can't go anywhere until they do something about it. Kind of like,
They should lock the doors.
yeah, lock the doors,
Yeah.
like they do with unions
Now they
and
should
negotiations.
tie their salaries to closing down the government.
Yeah, and we don't get paid to shut down, they shouldn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's what LBJ did once, well, he was president. The Congress failed to approve a budget. So he called in the head of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, the White House, and said, okay, let's agree on something now. And they did. And it was LBJ, who had a lot of personality and a lot of force. He knew how things worked in the Congress. Yes, please.
Is this series of lectures on the vice presidents going to continue past Andrew Johnson?
We're going to do a cycle on the vice presidents of the 20th century.
Okay.
Next.
It'll be next spring.
Okay.
That's that's next spring. So, people like Curtis and Henry Wallace and John Nance Garner and Nelson Rockefeller and Spiro Agnew. All right. Well, that's all. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.